The story of the Moabites begins with one of the most striking and morally complex narratives in the Hebrew Bible. Born from the desperation of Lot's daughters following the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the Moabites entered history through an act that would have been considered unthinkable in nearly every society: incest. Yet within the biblical narrative, the event is framed not with overt condemnation, but with a sober presentation of necessity, survival, and the preservation of lineage. Genesis chapter 19 recounts that after fleeing the catastrophic destruction of the cities, Lot and his daughters found refuge in a cave east of the Dead Sea. From that moment, a story unfolds that intertwines divine judgment, human weakness, and the origins of nations that would forever be both neighbours and rivals of Israel. Scholars and theologians have long debated the layers of meaning in this story, seeking to understand how a morally troubling act could produce not only a people, but also a theological rationale for their later marginalization in Israelite society. Archaeology and historical study complement this narrative, revealing that the Moabites became a culturally rich and politically significant people, even as the biblical story marks them for distinction and, in some interpretations, divine disfavor. Lot's story begins in the shadow of one of the most infamous moral catastrophes of the Bible, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. After separating from his uncle Abraham and settling in the fertile plains near the Jordan River, Lot lived in a city renowned for wickedness, whose name has become synonymous with moral corruption. Genesis chapter 19 recounts that God resolved to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah due to the extreme iniquity of their inhabitants. Angels warned Lot to flee without looking back, but tragedy struck when his wife disobeyed and was turned into a pillar of salt, a transformation that left him and his daughters alone in a devastated landscape. The narrative sets the stage for the morally charged birth of the Moabites, rooted in trauma, fear, and survival instincts. In the aftermath, Lot's daughters faced what they believed to be an impossible future. No men remained to continue their family line, and humanity itself seemed threatened. Their solution, conceived out of desperation, was to intoxicate their father and conceive children through him, a morally and socially transgressive act by any biblical or cultural standard. Genesis chapter 19 verses 30 to 38 describe the plan and its execution, resulting in the births of Moab and Ben-Ami. From their very conception, these children were associated with transgression, shaping the identity of the Moabites and Ammonites, and establishing a moral lens through which Israel and subsequent generations would view them. The narrative has long been a source of reflection for scholars and theologians. Jewish commentator Rashi emphasized that the daughters acted out of necessity, highlighting the tension between ethical law and survival in extreme circumstances. Augustine of Hippo later interpreted the story as evidence of human weakness and the unexpected ways in which divine providence can operate through morally ambiguous actions. These interpretations underscore that the Moabites' beginnings are morally complex, revealing both the fragility of human decision-making and the enduring consequences that arise from it. Geographically, the cave east of the Dead Sea became the ancestral locus of the Moabites. Archaeological surveys of highland settlements, including Dibon, Ar, and Kir Moab, show that from morally troubling beginnings, the Moabites established fortified communities and city-states, suggesting resilience and adaptive capability. Their highland settlements provided strategic advantages for defense and trade, allowing them to flourish despite being morally stigmatized in the biblical narrative. The story of Lot, his daughters, and the births of Moab and Ben-Ami highlights the interplay of desperation, morality, and divine providence. The incestuous conception set the stage for a people permanently marked by sin, whose identity, social standing, and historical interactions would forever be shaped by this origin. The tension between moral judgment and historical agency becomes a recurring theme in the narrative of Moab, establishing the central question of how people born in transgression navigate history and memory. The birth of Moab and the curse. The birth of Moab from Lot's eldest daughter represents a convergence of human desperation, moral transgression, and divine oversight. Genesis chapter 19, verses 30 to 38, recount the daughters' decision to preserve their lineage by conceiving children through their father while he slept, resulting in the birth of Moab and Ben-Ami. From their inception, these children were not simply offspring. They embodied the moral consequences of their parents' desperate actions. The Moabites, as descendants of this transgression, carried a legacy that would inform both Israelite perception and their own national identity for generations. Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 3 codifies the social and religious consequences of this act. Moabites were barred from entering the assembly of the Lord even to the 10th generation. By embedding moral judgment into law, the Israelites institutionalized the curse, transforming an ethical dilemma into a national boundary. The narrative emphasizes that transgression, even when born of necessity, carries enduring consequences, not only for individuals but for entire nations. Scholars highlight that this combination of genealogy and law illustrates how moral reasoning and cultural memory were deeply intertwined in Israelite society. Using origin narratives to explain and justify social boundaries and exclusion, Jewish and Christian commentators have reflected extensively on the ethical dimensions of this story. Rashi notes that the daughters acted from fear and necessity, not malicious intent, while Augustine saw in the story a demonstration of human frailty and the unpredictable workings of divine providence. Modern scholars, such as Michael Coogan, emphasize the etiological purpose of the narrative. It provides an explanation for Moabite identity, Israelite law, and the recurring moral tension between kinship and exclusion. Even as the story recounts sin, it also presents the possibility of historical and divine purpose emerging from morally fraught decisions. The archaeological record offers a complementary perspective. Excavations in Dibon, Ar, and Kir Moab reveal evidence of thriving city-states, religious monuments and inscriptions, including the Mesha stele circa 840 BCE to 835 BCE, which celebrate political victories and devotion to Chemosh. These findings demonstrate that the Moabites established a complex, organized, and resilient society despite their morally stigmatized origin. Their achievements highlight a tension between historical capability and narrative condemnation, showing that moral judgment did not preclude the exercise of political and cultural agency. The birth of Moab and the curse it engendered illustrates the duality at the heart of the Moabite story. They were both kin to Israel and morally stigmatized, capable of historical influence yet perpetually framed by divine and social judgment. Their origins define the trajectory of a people whose identity, legal standing, and historical perception were inseparable from the moral and theological consequences of their birth. Moabites and Ammonites, the legacy of sin. The Moabites and their cousins, the Ammonites, inherited a morally fraught beginning that shaped their identity and history. Settling in the highlands east of the Dead Sea, the Moabites developed fortified cities such as Dibon, Ar, and Kir Moab, while the Ammonites established themselves north of Moab around modern Amman. Both peoples demonstrated political, social, and economic sophistication, yet the biblical narrative consistently frames their achievements through the lens of inherited sin. Numbers chapters 22 through 25 recount how Moabite women led Israelite men into the worship of Baal Peor, prompting divine wrath. This episode is repeatedly interpreted as a reflection of the moral taint passed down from Lot's daughters, emphasizing the inseparable connection between genealogy and morality. Scholars note that the narrative functions both as a historical explanation for recurring conflict and as a moral framework for Israel, showing how origin stories shaped law, memory, and perception of neighboring nations. Archaeological evidence paints a nuanced picture of Moabite and Ammonite societies. Inscriptions and city remains show organized administrations, trade networks, and religious devotion, particularly to Chemosh among the Moabites and Milcom among the Ammonites. The Mesha stele, dating circa 840 BCE to 835 BCE, commemorates King Mesha's military victories over Israel and his piety toward Chemosh, asserting national identity despite biblical condemnation. These findings underscore that while moral narratives depicted Moabites as transgressors, in reality they were capable of formidable achievements. This duality, historical sophistication coexisting with inherited stigma, illustrates the enduring tension between narrative judgment and historical reality. The incestuous origin shaped not only identity but also social and political interaction. Israelite law, as recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 3, institutionalized exclusion, reflecting a collective moral judgment that framed the Moabites as outsiders, regardless of political or cultural accomplishment. Even alliances and periods of cooperation with Israel were limited by this stigma, highlighting how deeply moral narratives influenced historical perception. Scholars emphasize that the repeated moral framing of Moabite identity ensured that their origin remained central to both Israelite law and historiography, demonstrating the power of genealogy in shaping societal boundaries. The Moabites' cultural memory preserved the significance of their morally complicated origin across generations. Literary and prophetic texts repeatedly highlight their sinfulness, embedding the story of Lot's daughters and the resulting curse in the collective consciousness. Archaeological evidence, including urban planning, fortifications, and religious monuments, shows that historical resilience existed alongside moral condemnation. This tension between tangible achievements and ethical narrative underscores a recurring theme. History and morality were intertwined in the biblical worldview, and the Moabites exemplify this dynamic in both identity and legacy. The duality of kinship and exclusion remained central to Moabite-Israelite relations. As relatives by blood, the Moabites could not be entirely ignored, yet their morally tainted origin justified suspicion, war, and legal restrictions. This delicate balance between political necessity and ethical judgment is evident throughout biblical history, highlighting how a morally charged origin story can exert influence over centuries of social, military, and religious interactions. The Moabites thus become a case study in the enduring power of origin narratives to shape collective perception, historical memory, and moral reasoning. The curse and Israelite law. The Moabites' incestuous origin had direct legal and theological consequences codified in Israelite law. Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 3 establishes that no Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. This legal exclusion transformed the narrative of sin into a permanent social boundary, illustrating how morality and genealogy were inseparable in the biblical worldview. By embedding the curse into law, Israelite society ensured that Moabites remained morally suspect, socially marginalized, and perpetually defined by the transgression of their ancestors. Scholars argue that this demonstrates how narrative functions not merely as storytelling, but as a mechanism to justify social and political policy, shaping the perception of neighboring peoples for centuries. Numbers chapters 22 through 25 recount the recurring influence of Moabite women on Israelite men, leading them into idolatry with Baal Peor. These episodes reinforce the connection between inherited sin and moral consequence, portraying the Moabites as a nation whose transgressive origin continually influenced their behavior and relations with Israel. In this context, law, narrative, and morality converge, showing that divine judgment, social exclusion, and historical interpretation were all interwoven. The Moabites' curse became both an explanatory device and a moral lesson, ensuring that their origin remained central to how Israel understood justice, morality, and communal boundaries. Despite these restrictions, the Moabites established significant social and political structures. Archaeological evidence from Dibon, Ar, and Kir Moab demonstrates urban development, fortifications, and religious institutions, revealing that historical capability coexisted with moral condemnation. Even when Israelite law sought to exclude them, the Moabites exercised agency, military strength, and cultural continuity, highlighting the tension between legal moral narrative and historical reality. The Mesha Stele circa 840 BCE to 835 BCE commemorates Moabite victories and devotion to Chemosh, providing evidence of the nation's resilience in the face of divine judgment and social exclusion. Individual redemption within the nation is exemplified in the story of Ruth. A Moabitess who displayed loyalty, faith, and moral integrity, Ruth integrated into Israelite society, eventually becoming the great-grandmother of King David. While her story demonstrates that individuals could transcend collective stigma, it simultaneously reinforces that the Moabites as a people remained under the shadow of a curse. The tension between collective moral judgment and individual virtue emerges as a recurring theme, illustrating the nuanced interplay between origin, law, and redemption. The curse also framed Israelite perception of Moab across generations. Social, political, and religious interactions were filtered through moral narrative, ensuring that the Moabites' origins dictated their treatment in law, literature, and diplomacy. Scholars observe that this phenomenon exemplifies the enduring power of moral storytelling to shape historical consciousness, social policy, and theological reasoning. Through law, narrative, and ritual, the Moabites' birth in incest and the resulting curse became a defining factor in the moral and social imagination of Israelite society. Moabite society under the shadow of curse. Despite the stigma of their origin, the Moabites built a resilient and sophisticated society. Archaeological evidence shows fortified cities, administrative structures, and temples dedicated to Chemosh, revealing a civilization capable of political organization, military engagement, and religious devotion. The Mesha Stele, circa 840 BCE to 835 BCE, celebrates King Mesha's victories over Israel, his devotion to Chemosh, and the expansion of Moabite influence, demonstrating that historical agency persisted even under the weight of moral judgment. Scholars note that this juxtaposition narrative condemnation alongside tangible achievement illustrates how moral narratives do not negate historical capability, but instead frame it within ethical and theological parameters. The Moabites' interactions with Israel were shaped by both kinship and exclusion. Episodes of conflict, such as the idolatry at Baal Peor and temporary alliances against common threats, illustrate the complex moral and political relationship between the two nations. Biblical texts interpret Moabite behavior through the lens of inherited sin, yet historical evidence shows pragmatic political agency. This duality highlights the tension between narrative morality and political reality, demonstrating how the curse influenced both perception and historical engagement. Geography played a crucial role in Moabite resilience. The highlands east of the Dead Sea offered natural defenses, fertile land for agriculture, and access to trade routes connecting to the wider Levant. Urban centers like Dibon, Kir, Moab, and Ar were fortified and strategically located, suggesting that Moabite society was capable of sustaining long-term political and economic activity despite biblical condemnation. Archaeologists emphasize that these settlements reflect a civilization thriving in practical terms while remaining morally stigmatized in the Israelite narrative. Religious devotion also reinforced national identity. Temples to Chemosh, inscriptions, and sacrificial practices indicate a highly organized and enduring religious culture, intertwining civic and spiritual life. Scholars note that Moabite piety and ritual practice often functioned as both assertion of autonomy and reinforcement of cultural cohesion, enabling the society to endure external pressures while maintaining a distinctive identity rooted in moral narrative and divine accountability. The curse shaped not only Israelite perception but also internal Moabite identity. Historical resilience coexisted with moral consciousness, and the narrative of incest informed collective memory, law, and intergenerational storytelling. Moabites inherited both the consequences of sin and the capacity for achievement, creating a society that balanced moral narrative, political reality, and cultural continuity. The curse in cultural memory and modern interpretation. The Moabites' incestuous origin and the curse imposed on them were preserved in cultural memory across centuries. Israelite law, literature, and ritual emphasized the consequences of moral transgression, ensuring that the story of Lot's daughters remained central to the collective consciousness. Even as Moabite cities flourished, biblical texts framed their achievements through the lens of inherited sin, reinforcing boundaries of exclusion, suspicion, and ethical judgment. Modern scholars argue that this narrative strategy demonstrates how societies use origin stories to codify morality, explain historical events, and maintain social cohesion. Ruth, as a morally exemplary Moabitess, provides a counterpoint to collective stigma, demonstrating that individual virtue could transcend inherited moral consequence. Her integration into Israelite society illustrates a nuanced understanding of sin, redemption, and divine providence. Yet, her story also underscores the exceptionality of moral transcendence, as the Moabites collectively remained under the shadow of their cursed birth. Archaeology offers further perspective on the tension between historical capability and narrative moral framing. Temples, fortifications, and administrative inscriptions attest to Moabite resilience and cultural sophistication, highlighting the discrepancy between moral narrative and societal achievement. Scholars note that this dynamic illustrates the enduring influence of origin stories in shaping perception, memory, and cultural interpretation, demonstrating that historical reality and ethical narrative coexist in complex ways. The Moabite story also reflects broader patterns in the ancient Near East, where neighboring peoples' genealogies were often interpreted through morally charged stories. The tale of Moab's birth thus operates as both historical explanation and ethical allegory, reinforcing cultural memory while providing insight into ancient perceptions of morality, kinship, and divine judgment. Ultimately, the narrative of incest and curse exemplifies the intersection of law, morality, and historical reality. The Moabites demonstrate how birth, transgression, and divine judgment can shape a people's identity, perception, and legacy across generations, offering lessons that resonate in theological, historical, and cultural studies alike. Moab in conflict and alliance. The Moabites' morally tainted origin cast a long shadow over their political and military interactions with Israel and neighboring peoples, influencing both how they were perceived and how they conducted themselves as a nation. From the earliest biblical accounts, the consequences of their incestuous beginnings shaped their role on the historical stage, establishing a dual identity. They were kin to Israel, yet morally suspect in the eyes of their neighbors. Numbers chapters 22 through 25 recount the episode of the Moabite women enticing Israelite men to worship Baal Peor, a pivotal moment that not only provoked divine anger, but also reinforced the enduring perception of Moabite corruption as a direct consequence of their ancestral transgression. Scholars note that these narratives function both as historical explanations for recurring conflict and as moral instruction, embedding the idea that the sins of origin have lasting repercussions, influencing the course of diplomacy, warfare, and social interaction. Despite the biblical condemnation, historical evidence shows that Moabite society exercised significant agency and political sophistication. Fortified cities such as Dibon, Ar, and Kir Moab, revealed through archaeological excavations, attest to strategic planning and military preparedness that allowed Moab to assert influence over its region. King Mesha, who ruled circa 840 BCE to 835 BCE, stands as the most prominent example of Moabite leadership, exercising both military and political authority. His inscriptions on the Mesha stele recount victories over Israel, territorial expansion, and devotion to Chemosh, the Moabite deity, providing a vivid portrait of a people asserting autonomy and resilience, despite the moral narrative framing them as inherently sinful. These accomplishments highlight the tension between biblical moral judgment and historical reality, demonstrating that the Moabites were far more than passive victims of divine or social condemnation. Temporary alliances with Israel and other regional powers further illustrate the complex interplay of morality, politics, and pragmatism. While Israelite law, as codified in Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 3, barred Moabites from the assembly of the Lord, political necessity sometimes required cooperation. During periods of external threat from neighboring Aramean kingdoms or Assyrian incursions, Moabite and Israelite forces occasionally acted in concert. Yet these alliances were always tempered by underlying moral suspicion. The narrative emphasis on inherited sin in these encounters suggests that moral origin remained the primary lens through which interactions were interpreted, reinforcing a perception that Moabite success or influence was temporary or morally conditional, no matter their military or political capability. Geography played a central role in both conflict and defense. The highlands east of the Dead Sea offered natural fortifications, fertile land for agriculture, and control over trade routes connecting Moab to Ammon, Edom, and the Transjordanian corridor. Archaeological surveys reveal extensive fortification walls, watchtowers, and strategically placed settlements, showing that Moabite leaders understood the importance of terrain in warfare and diplomacy. This geographical advantage allowed Moab to maintain relative independence while exerting influence over trade and regional politics, highlighting that the society was capable of sustaining complex political and military structures even while subject to moral condemnation in Israelite memory. The recurring theme of conflict in Moabite history also reflects broader theological and ethical considerations. The biblical writers consistently interpret Moabite military or political action through the lens of divine judgment, framing victories as fleeting and failures as inevitable consequences of sin. This interpretive framework reinforced the idea that the nation's incestuous origin had moral and historical consequences, demonstrating the enduring impact of genealogical transgression. Yet, material evidence, including fortifications, urban development, and religious inscriptions, underscores that the Moabites were not simply defined by moral stigma. They were a people capable of resilience, strategic planning, and cultural sophistication, navigating a world in which ethical judgment and historical reality were inseparably intertwined. Moreover, the Moabites' conflicts were not solely external. Internal governance, succession disputes, and city-state rivalries reveal that moral and political challenges were intertwined. Kings like Mesha had to consolidate authority, manage local elites, and maintain religious legitimacy, balancing domestic stability with the pressures of foreign relations and historical legacy. Scholars suggest that these internal dynamics were influenced by the narrative of inherited curse, as leaders operated under the awareness that their nation's origins shaped perception, both internally and externally. The tension between moral narrative and historical pragmatism thus permeated every aspect of Moabite life, from governance to warfare, religion to diplomacy. In the end, Moabite history demonstrates that a morally stigmatized origin did not prevent historical agency, but rather shaped the context in which that agency was exercised. Their incestuous beginnings and the divine curse that followed influenced diplomacy, warfare, and alliances, creating a complex interplay between perception, morality, and political action. The Moabites navigated a world in which they were constantly judged for their ancestry, yet they established a civilization capable of military strength, strategic alliances, and cultural achievement, illustrating the enduring tension between moral narrative and historical reality. Through conflict and cooperation, conquest and resilience, the Moabite story in Chapter 7 underscores how deeply origins, morality, and divine judgment influence both the perception and trajectory of an entire nation. Redemption, memory, and enduring legacy. While the Moabites' national curse endured across generations, the biblical narrative also preserves moments of individual redemption that demonstrate the possibility of moral transcendence, even within a cursed lineage. The most striking example is Ruth, a Moabitess whose loyalty, piety, and courage allowed her to integrate fully into Israelite society. Ruth's marriage to Boaz, a direct descendant of David, not only secured her personal redemption but also ensured that the Moabitess became an ancestor of the Israelite monarchy. Her story, recounted in the Book of Ruth, highlights a critical nuance in biblical thought. While collective judgment persists, divine providence and moral integrity can override inherited stigma at the individual level. Scholars have often noted that Ruth's narrative demonstrates a deliberate literary strategy, showing how a morally tainted nation could contribute positively to Israel's history, thereby complicating the simple equation of national curse and transgression. Cultural memory of the Moabites' origin preserved the moral weight of their birth through law, ritual, and literary tradition. Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 3's restriction on Moabites entering the assembly of the Lord was not merely a legal matter. It symbolized centuries of ethical and theological reflection on the consequences of human transgression. By codifying the curse, Israelite society ensured that the story of Lot's daughters, Moab's conception, and the moral ramifications of incest would endure as a cautionary tale for generations. Yet archaeological evidence, from the Mesha stele circa 840 BCE to 835 BCE to fortified highland cities like Dibon and Ar, reveals a Moabite civilization that was capable of political governance, religious devotion, and military resilience. The tension between moral narrative and historical reality illustrates how cultural memory can preserve judgment, while the material record shows achievement, agency, and sophistication. The Moabites' religious life further reinforced national identity despite the shadow of curse. Temples dedicated to Chemosh, ritual sacrifices and inscriptions documenting civic and religious activities demonstrate that moral condemnation did not prevent the cultivation of a rich spiritual and cultural tradition. Scholars suggest that this interplay between religion, governance, and inherited stigma reflects a society acutely aware of its morally charged origins, yet determined to assert autonomy, identity, and resilience. The Mesha stele, in particular, celebrates military victories and devotion to Chemosh, framing Moabite success as both religiously sanctioned and historically tangible, providing insight into how a people perceived their own destiny in light of divine judgment. Redemption, therefore, exists alongside persistent stigma. Ruth embodies the potential for individuals to transcend moral inheritance, showing that while collective judgment shapes history and identity, divine providence allows exceptions. At the same time, the Moabites' broader society, as evidenced by settlements, governance, and material culture, continued to operate under the shadow of a moral narrative that emphasized sin and divine oversight. This duality reinforces the enduring biblical theme that human action, divine will, and inherited circumstance are intimately connected, producing a complex moral and historical tapestry. Even in literature and prophetic memory, Moab's curse functions as both warning and explanatory device. Prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah reference Moab as a morally compromised neighbor, yet their texts also recognize historical achievements and moments of temporary political influence. Scholars argue that these literary strategies illustrate the integration of moral theology and historical consciousness, framing Moab as both a cautionary example and a historical actor. The enduring legacy of the Moabites thus lies in their dual identity, a people capable of agency, accomplishment, and spiritual devotion, yet forever marked by the circumstances of their incestuous conception. In this way, this underscores the nuanced relationship between national curse, individual redemption, and cultural memory. The Moabites' moral and historical trajectory was shaped by the actions of their ancestors, the divine judgment they inherited, and the ethical lessons preserved in Israelite literature. Ruth's story, along with archaeological and textual evidence, demonstrates that moral transgression does not erase human capability, yet it imposes consequences that shape identity, memory, and legacy. The Moabites endured as a people defined by both sin and resilience, illustrating the long-lasting influence of origins on history, culture, and morality. Decline, memory, and lasting influence. By the time of Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian domination, Moab had lost much of its political independence, yet the memory of their incestuous beginnings continued to define how surrounding nations, particularly Israel, perceived them. Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 3 codified this moral boundary, reinforcing exclusion and social caution for generations. Even as Moabite cities like Dibon, Kir Moab, and Ar continued to function as administrative and religious centers, the biblical narrative interprets their successes and failures through the lens of inherited sin. Military defeats, subjugation by foreign powers, and periods of economic hardship are presented not only as historical events but also as moral consequences of their ancestral transgression. Archaeological evidence complicates the purely moral narrative, revealing a society that was sophisticated, resilient, and capable of adaptation. Fortifications, temples, inscriptions, and material culture attest to Moabite agency and cultural continuity, even under foreign rule. The Mesha stele circa 840 BCE to 835 BCE, for example, records King Mesha's victories and devotion to Chemosh, highlighting the ways in which Moabites interpreted their own history through religious and political frameworks. Scholars note that these material remains illustrate a civilization that persisted in the face of both moral stigma and historical adversity, demonstrating the tension between narrative judgment and lived reality. The Moabites' morally tainted origin continued to shape intergenerational perception. Israelite writers, prophets, and historians interpreted Moabite actions in light of the curse, framing their military and political activity as expressions of inherited sin. Yet individual Moabites, most notably Ruth, illustrate that divine providence and moral virtue could transcend collective judgment, creating space for exceptionality within a morally constrained framework. This juxtaposition between collective condemnation and individual potential demonstrates the complex moral theology underpinning Israelite historiography and provides insight into how the biblical authors understood causality, ethics, and divine justice. Cultural memory preserved the significance of Moab's origin long after the political power of the Moabites waned. Laws, rituals, literature, and prophetic texts ensured that the story of incest and curse remained central to the moral imagination of Israel and surrounding peoples. Even as cities fell and empires absorbed their territory, the narrative of Moab's morally fraught birth continued to inform attitudes toward kinship, loyalty, and divine judgment. Archaeological evidence reminds us, however, that the society itself was capable, organized, and spiritually vibrant, reinforcing the recurring theme that narrative condemnation does not erase historical achievement. The Moabite story is a study in the enduring impact of origin, on identity, perception, and legacy. Born from incest and permanently marked for a curse, they navigated centuries of moral judgment, social exclusion, and political challenge, while maintaining resilience, cultural complexity, and historical presence. Their decline does not erase their significance. Rather, it underscores the long-lasting interplay between human action, divine judgment, and the power of narrative memory. Scholars, theologians, and archaeologists alike continue to examine Moab as an example of how morally charged beginnings can shape both historical trajectory and cultural consciousness for millennia. The Moabites' legacy, therefore, is both cautionary and instructive. Their morally transgressive birth explains the persistent social and theological boundaries imposed upon them, while their historical achievements demonstrate that human agency can coexist with inherited moral consequences. In the end, the Moabites endure as a symbol of the profound and lasting effects of human transgression, divine judgment, and the intertwined forces of history, memory, and morality.